Chapter 43, Tipping Point. St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Molly came out of the small side room in her favorite lab, switching off the lights. She walked across the dark room, sighing tiredly. As she reached the door leading out to the corridor, she heard a voice behind her say, "You're wrong, you know." Molly gasped, jumping slightly, and turned around to see the voice's source, none other than the dark-haired Sherlock Holmes. "You do count," Sherlock continued on quietly. "You've always counted, and I've always trusted you." He turned and looked at her. "But you were right. I'm not okay." "Tell me what's wrong," Molly said softly. "Molly," Sherlock said, walking towards her, "I think I'm going to die." "What do you need?" Molly asked in concern. "If I wasn't everything that you think I am," Sherlock said, still walking towards her, everything that I think I am, would you still want to help me?" His voice wavered in pain, and tears watered in his eyes. Sherlock had undoubtedly brought this upon himself. He let sentiment get the better of him. The thought of losing Amelia unbearable to him. She was truly brilliant, and she'd let that blind him. He'd fallen for her just as she had fallen for him. What he was about to do would break Amelia's heart, possibly forever. But she'd be safe, from him and from Moriarty. "What do you need?" Molly said, looking up at Sherlock as he stopped in front of her. Sherlock skipped even closer to her. "You." Diogenes Club. Mycroft walked across the common room and into a smaller private room, reaching to close the door handle. He stopped as he realized Amelia was sitting in one of the armchairs, her feet kicked up on the side table as she idly flipped through Katie's file, John sitting beside her. "She has really done her homework, Miss Riley. Things that only someone close to Sherlock could know," Amelia remarked casually, narrowing her eyes at her colleague. "Ah," Mycroft said, closing the door. "Have you seen your brother's address book lately?" Amelia questioned tightly. "3 names. Yours, John's, and mine. And Moriarty sure as hell didn't get this stuff from John, or me." Mycroft walked across the room, looking at Amelia. "Amelia, so how does it work then, your relationship?" Amelia hissed. "Do you go out for coffee now and then, eh? You and James?" She bared her teeth as Mycroft sat down in his chair, opposite to Amelia lowering her feet to lean forward and glare at Mycroft. "Your own brother, and you babbled about his entire life to this maniac." I never dreamt. Amelia rolled her eyes, interrupting him. "So this is what you're trying to tell John, isn't it? Watch their backs, 'cause I've made a mistake." She clasped her hands. "You helped me bring down Moriarty, and now you're working with him." She slammed the file down on the table, leaning back in her chair as she tried to stay calm. "How did this start?" Mycroft drew in a long breath tiredly. "People like him. We know about them. We watch them. But James Moriarty, the most dangerous criminal mind the world has ever seen. In his pocket, the ultimate weapon, a key code, a few lines of computer code that can unlock any door. And you abduct him to try and find the key code?" Amelia growled. "Why was I not alerted?" "Because of your association with him," Mycroft answered, exhausted. "We interrogated him for weeks." "And?" John asked, prompting him. It was the first words he'd spoken since he had arrived, and even Mycroft seemed surprised by John's question. "He wouldn't play along." "Damn straight he didn't," Amelia said in a dull tone, folding her arms across her chest. "He just sat there staring into darkness. The only thing that made him open up. I could get him to talk, just a little, but—" He trailed off in embarrassment. "In return you had to offer him Sherlock's life story," John finished grimly. "So one big lie. Sherlock's a fraud, but people will swallow it because the rest of it's true." He leaned forward in his chair. "Moriarty wants Sherlock destroyed, right? And you have given him the perfect ammunition," John smiled bitterly at Mycroft. Mycroft, looking down at the ground as Amelia and John got to their feet. "John," Mycroft said. John turned back to look at him, while Amelia refused to even meet Mycroft's gaze. "I'm sorry." "Oh, please," John said tightly, looking to Amelia. "There's only one person in the world who's ever loved him, and it's not you." He shook his head in disbelief, laughing humorously as he walked to the door. "Tell him, would you?" Mycroft pleaded as John opened the door and walked away. Amelia hesitated in the open doorway, looking back at Mycroft forlornly. Mycroft opened his mouth to say something, but she shook her head and silently walked off, leaving the door wide open behind her. At St. Bart's lab, Sherlock sat on the floor of the lab, leaning against the lab bench. He threw his rubber ball down off the floor, bouncing it against the cupboard before catching it and repeating the action. His eyes were glazed over, Sherlock too engrossed in his thoughts to pay attention to reality. He had searched under every rock, turned over every thought, but was still unsure of how he had survived his imminent death. Certainly, there were a few options, but they required John and Amelia staying in one spot, or some ludicrous amount of stunt work. Sherlock's brow twitched as he tried to eliminate few of the more difficult plans. "Got your message," Amelia said, stepping into the lab, John right behind her. She eyed her fiancé in concern, worried about the look on his tired face. Moriarty had certainly taken their toll on all of them. Amelia had large bags under her eyes that she couldn't cover up, despite her superb makeup skills. John's limp was starting to come back, although Amelia highly doubted that John had noticed, and Sherlock's dark hair was even more unruly than usual. The locks matted and tangled due to his long, sleepless nights, too engrossed in bringing down Moriarty to even think about sleeping or taking a shower. Amelia held back a yawn, tears watering in her eyes due to the effort. Sherlock caught the ball, holding onto it tightly in his hand. The computer code is key to this. If we find it, we can use it. Beat Moriarty at his own game, Sherlock said, still thinking. He briefly looked over to Amelia in concern. He was concerned about how much power Amelia had over him, not because he was still against sentiment, which he was, although it was different when it came to Amelia, but because he knew that Moriarty would use it to his advantage, like he had so many times before. Sherlock's eyes flickered down to Amelia's usually impeccable nails, noticing chips in her black nail varnish where she had bit her fingernails nervously. Sherlock's gaze drifted to Amelia's right palm, where tiny crescent scars were marked by the pale skin. He immediately matched their size and shape to Amelia's own fingernails, pursing his lips in worry. "What do you mean, use it?" asked John in confusion. "He used it to create a false identity," Sherlock explained calmly in a silent anger for Moriarty. "So we can use it to break into the records and destroy Richard Brooke. And bring back Jim Moriarty again," John said in a tone of understanding. "Somewhere in 221B, Sherlock said, rising to his feet. "Somewhere on the day of the verdict. He left it hidden." He faced the bench, placing both of his hands on the counter. "Uh-huh," John said, he and his sister stepping to Sherlock's side. John took his place on Sherlock's right, Amelia on the left of the consulting detective. Amelia placed her hand atop Sherlock's cool and slightly clammy, although she never tell him, left hand. He looked down at her, Amelia watching him in mild interest with a small smirk dancing on her blood-red lips. He smiled weakly back at her, knowing she was just as concerned about him as he was of her. Every time she looked at Sherlock, she was flooded with memories of their first meeting, where he had wanted nothing to do with them. She was slightly amused at how it was Sherlock who'd convinced her to stay at 221B, rather than moving out after her first month there like she had intended to. He even willingly handed over his bedroom to her, although he refused to take his stuff out of the room. How far we've come, Amelia thought, her eyes still on Sherlock. It felt like only yesterday when they had solved the Karl Powers conundrum, or the great game as Jean called it. Amelia preferred her title for the case. It had a nice ring to it. John pursed his lip, looking down at Sherlock at Amelia's hands, before back up at Sherlock. "What did he touch?" "An apple," Amelia answered quietly. Sherlock drawing his fingers on the lab bench as he thought. "Nothing else? Did you write anything down?" "No," Sherlock said. John took in a sharp breath between his teeth, racking his brain for an answer. He drummed his fingers against the bench, unconsciously copying his closest friend. He turned away and walked across the lab, letting out a breath. Sherlock furrowed his brow, lifting the fingers of his right hand. Amelia watched him with a raised brow questioningly. Sherlock hesitated, then drummed his last finger, beating out a specific rhythm. The rhythm Moriarty had drummed when he had come over. A binary code began to form in Sherlock's mind palace, assigning each beat of Moriarty's fingers to a number. "Go take care of your brother," Sherlock said to Amelia, quite enough so she could hear, but John couldn't. "Sherlock, are you going to tell me—" Amelia started. "He needs you more than ever," Sherlock interrupted kindly, tilting Amelia's chin up to look her in her exhausted, silvery eyes. She let out a small sigh and walked over to John, murmuring her assurance that they'd get through whatever Moriarty threw at them, unscathed. But she couldn't help but feel a bit nervous. Sooner or later, someone would get hurt, and she could only hope it wasn't Sherlock or John. Sherlock turned his back to the Watsons, taking out his phone out of his pocket and sending a text to a number he had long since memorized. Moriarty's personal cell. Come and play. Bart's Hospital Rooftop. S.H. P.S. Got something of yours you might want back. Sherlock sent the message, tucking his phone into his jacket pocket, and turning back towards the bench, deep in thought. What would happen next would be the tipping point. Of that Sherlock was certain. However, the question of who would come out alive still loomed over Sherlock's head. If his life were a Conan Doyle novel, as so many newspapers compared it to, he would be certain that he, John, and Amelia would come out alive. But this was reality, and it was Moriarty they'd been dealing with, the most dangerous criminal of all time. Sherlock's eyes glazed over as he immersed himself in his mind palace, only snapping back to reality when John tapped Sherlock on his shoulder a few hours later. Sherlock, John whispered. Sherlock blinked a few times, clearing his mind. Yes? She's asleep, John said, pointing over to where Amelia had dozed off in an office chair, wrapped up snugly in Sherlock's thick coat, hers set to the side. For the first time in what seemed like years, she had a peaceful look on her face, so different than the mask, the persona she wore while she was awake. Sherlock understood why Amelia guarded her emotions so carefully, as demonstrated clearly by not telling Sherlock about her depression, although she still didn't know that Sherlock knew. Amelia had been trained by none other than Mycroft to hide her emotions away, and despite how much she tended to show them recently, she was still remarkably good at faking emotions. But, as she slept, she let her mask down like a masquerade ball at midnight, where everyone's true selves were revealed. Her eyes darted out under her eyelid. Her eyes darted about under her eyelids, and a small, genuine smile danced on her lips. She shifted in her sleep, pulling her knees up into her chest. Sherlock watched with a sharp pain shooting through his chest. Because by this time tomorrow, one of the two people Amelia had fallen for, and them for her, would be dead. And there was no telling who it would be. Chapter 44. Memento Vivere. Dawn, St. Bart's lab. Dawn's first rays were peeking over the horizon, just as Amelia awoke. She blinked away the grogginess of sleep, holding back a yawn. Sherlock had not moved from his spot since he'd fallen asleep, although he dragged over a chair and sat down on it, kicking his feet up on the lab bench. He rolled his ball across the top of the bench, looking up to meet Amelia's tired gaze with a soft smile. She returned the action, rising to her feet. She stretched out, flexing every joint and muscle, reminding Sherlock very much of a cat. She took care to remain silent, noticing John sleeping on a stool nearby. Amelia walked over to Sherlock, rubbing her eyes as she let out a large yawn. Hey, you, Amelia whispered. Hello, Sherlock replied formally. Amelia set her hand down on Sherlock, stopping him from rolling his ball. We'll beat him, she said, referring to Moriarty. We have to. At what cost? Sherlock said tiredly. His eyes had sunken into his skull due to the combination of his sleepless nights and his stress. He bit his lower lip in a nervous manner, something that was quite out of character for the consulting detective. I could lose you. But you won't, Amelia assured with a kind smile, brushing the back of her hand against Sherlock's angular cheeks. Sherlock catching her hand and placing a kiss on it before letting it go. She let out a soft laugh, blushing when John stirred. Oops. Sherlock rolled his eyes and sat down where he was before, completely still, already deep in thought. Only the steady rise and fall of Sherlock's chest and the occasional twitch of Sherlock's face muscles let Amelia know he was still alive. She hopped onto the lab bench, shooting a look at Sherlock when he resumed his ball rolling. Amelia looked up, startled, as John's phone rang, the sound trilling throughout the silent lab. John lifted his head sleepily as he groaned and answered the phone. Amelia trying to piece together the conversation from John's reply. Yeah, speaking, said John, pausing as someone told him something. What? John got to his feet. What happened? Is she okay? Oh my god. Right, yes, I'm coming. John switched off his phone, tucking it away. What is it? Asked Sherlock. Paramedics, John said. Miss Hudson, she's been shot. Amelia's eyes widened, concerned for the woman who had become like a mother to her. What? How? Amelia jumped off the lab bench, running a hand through her hair tiredly. Well, probably one of the killers you managed to track, John said frantically. Jesus, she's dying. Sherlock, let's go. He and Amelia turned towards the door, Amelia buttoning up her coat. You two go. I'm busy, Sherlock said flippantly, completely disinterested. Busy? John replied, appalled. Thinking, Sherlock said, answering John's rhetorical question. I need to think. You need to... John trailed off. John trailed off, looking furious to... Took furious to be able to finish. Oh, too furious to be able to finish. Doesn't she mean anything to you? You only half killed a man because he laid a finger on her. Sherlock shrugged. She's my landlady. She's dying, Amelia growled fiercely, waving a hand towards Sherlock in anger. You machine! John looked down, shaking his head. Saw this. He started towards the door. You stay here if you want, on your own. Alone is what I have, Sherlock stated. Alone protects me. Amelia opened the door, looking back over her shoulder at her fiancé. No. Friends protect people. Sentiment protects people. She pulled the ring off her finger, throwing it down at Sherlock's feet as both the Watsons left the room. Sherlock looked up as the door slammed shut, eyes flickering down to the engagement ring. An overwhelming wave of guilt washed over him, threatening to drown Sherlock in his own emotions. Sentiment protects people. Amelia's words ran through Sherlock's mind. Sherlock was already regretting what he said, but he needed to keep Amelia safe. Not wanted. Needed. He needed for Amelia to stay safe. He needed Amelia's support. He couldn't bear to think of what would happen if all this ceased to exist. Then his phone rang, an alert. I'm waiting. J.M. Sherlock shook his head free of all doubt and got to his feet, walking across the lab as he buttoned his blazer. Sherlock grabbed his coat and left the room, a cold expression on his face. St. Bart Hospital roof. Sherlock stepped onto the roof of the hospital, slowly walking towards James Moriarty sitting on the edge of the roof in a new Westwood suit. His dark hair slicked back. James held in his hand his phone, which was playing the Bee Gees' Stayin' Alive. Ah, here we are, at last, you and me, Sherlock, and our problem, the final problem, said James, without looking at Sherlock, holding his phone up higher. Stayin' alive, it's so boring, isn't it? Angrily, he stopped the song and switched the phone off. It's just... He held his hand out flat, skimming slowly through the air, completely level. Staying. Sherlock pulled his hand back, hiding his face in it instead as Sherlock paced around the roof, searching the surroundings. All my life, continued on James, I've been searching for distractions. You are the best distraction, and now I don't even have you, because I've beaten you. Sherlock turned to look at him, James still going on. And you know what? In the end, it was easy. Sherlock stopped shortly, folding his hands behind his back as he looked at James. It was easy. James resumed his speech. Now, I've got to go back to playing with the ordinary people, and it turns out you're ordinary, just like all of them. I suppose I'll have Amelia, but she'll have to die sometime or another. He lowered his head again, once again looking up at Sherlock. Ah, well, he got to his feet, walking closer and starting to pace around the detective. Did you almost start to wonder if I was real? Did I nearly get you? Richard Brooke, Sherlock said simply, the 2 words enough an answer for James. Nobody seems to get the joke, but you do. Of course, Sherlock said. Attaboy. Rich Brooke in German is Reichenbach, the case that made my name, Sherlock elaborated, watching James carefully. Just trying to have some fun, James said in a fake American accent that Sherlock knew Amelia would disapprove of. James circled Sherlock, looking down to Sherlock's hands to see that Sherlock was beating a rhythm with his fingers. Good, you got that too. Beats like digits, Sherlock said, flashing back to James, sitting at 221B, drumming his fingers on his knee. Every beat is a 1. Every rest is a 0. Binary code. That's why all those assassins tried to save my life and Amelia's. It was hidden on us, hidden inside our heads, a few simple lines of computer code that can break into any system. I told you, my clients. Last one to Sherlock. I told all my clients. Last one to Sherlock's is a sissy, James said proudly. Of course, Amelia was never going to be harmed. It'd be a waste. Such a waste. Yes, Sherlock said, gesturing his head. But now that it's up here, I can use it to alter all the records. I can kill Rich Brooks and bring back Jim Moriarty. James stared at him for a moment, turning away with a disapproving and forlorn expression. No. This is too easy, James mumbled, hiding his face in his hands. This is too easy. There is no key. Doofus, he screamed, his final word into Sherlock's face, eyes wide and manic. Those digits are meaningless. They're utterly meaningless. Sherlock didn't bother to disguise the confusion on his face. You don't really think a couple of lines of computer code are going to crash the world around our ears? James questioned. I'm disappointed. He turned away, lumbering across the roof as he used a moronic-sounding voice as he continued on talking. I'm disappointed in you, Sherlock. But the rhythm... Partita number 1, thank you. Johann Sebastian Bach. Then how did I break into the bank? To the tower? To the prison? James turned around, spreading his arms wide. Daylight robbery. All it takes is some willing participants. I knew you'd fall for it. That's your weakness. You always want everything to be clever. Now, shall we finish the game? One final act? Glad you chose a tall building. Nice way to do it. Do it? Do what? Sherlock asked, blinking as he understood. Yes, of course. My suicide. Genius detective proved to be fraud. I read it in the papers, so it must be true. I love newspapers. Fairy tales, Jim said with a grin. Sherlock walked to the edge of the roof, leaning forward to look down at the ground. James walked over and stood beside him, looking down over the side as well. And pretty grim ones, too. He looked up at Sherlock with an ominous grin. 221B. John and Amelia jumped out of the cab, Amelia rummaging through her pocket and retrieving the key to the flat. In a hurry, she nearly dropped the keys, but after a second she managed to unlock it successfully, as the two Watsons ran inside. A large man on a slab ladder was drilling holes into the wall, Mrs. Hudson standing by and observing him. Amelia gasped, running towards Mrs. Hudson and enveloping her in her embrace. "Oh, God, Amy, you made me jump!" Mrs. Hudson exclaimed. "But," Amelia said in shock, letting go of Mrs. Hudson and holding her at arm's length, scanning the older woman's entire body to check that it was actually her. "Is everything okay now with the police? Has, Sherlock sorted it all out?" Mrs. Hudson asked. Amelia stared at her for a moment longer, the gears turning in her head. Then it all clicked. "Oh my God," she murmured, wildly running out of the flat, John staring after her in disbelief. "Taxi!" Amelia shouted, stepping into the road and clearing the nearby cab. "Taxi!" A man stood at the side of the road, having hailed at the cab at the same time. He was a few steps closer. He managed to get there before Amelia, telling the cabby his destination. Amelia ran around the cab, pulling open the back door, shoving John into the seat. No, police, sort of," Amelia said to the man who was glaring at her angrily, waving her MI6 badge at him. The man eyed her, scowling. "Oh, thanks, mate. Look, thanks a lot," he sneered sarcastically. St. Bart's Hospital roof. "I can still prove that you created an entirely false identity," Sherlock said to James. James rolled his eyes in exasperation, surprised how much the consulting detective wished to live. No doubt it was for Amelia. "Oh, my dear Amelia," James thought with a sly smile. "How you've touched all of us." He could remember the day the two of them had met perfectly. How her hair had been a golden blonde rather than her natural, lustrous brown color it was now. How she sat every day in the same cafe, watching people pass by and deduct as much as she could about them. Amelia, James had noticed, could do something small, and it would affect an immeasurable amount of people's. She had a certain way of knowing how to play people, use their weakness, their pressure points, as she called them, to her advantage. Amelia was nowhere near the angel people made her to be. Her ledger was dripping with red, dripping with the terrible deeds she had done. James had yet to decide who would be better for Amelia, him or Sherlock. Certainly, they both connected with different aspects of her. James knew all of Amelia's dark secrets. He'd seen her twisted mind firsthand, and how she enjoyed the thrill of power that came with holding someone's life in her hands. Sherlock, however, was everything Amelia aspired to be. Their personalities complemented each other, and unlike how James and Amelia clashed, together they were nearly unbeatable. But it was James they were facing. James, who'd throw everything he had at them, break them down, piece by piece. "Oh, just kill yourself. It's a lot less effort," James said finally. Sherlock turned away, impatient. "Go on, for me. For Amelia. You do want to keep her safe, don't you? Please?" That was the last straw for Sherlock. He grabbed James by the collar of his coat with both hands, spinning the consulting criminal around, holding him over the edge of the roof. Sherlock's breathing became heavy and labored as he looked into the dark, soulless eyes of James Moriarty, who was watching him in interest. "You're insane," Sherlock breathed out. James blinked by the obvious deduction. "You're just getting that now?" James asked. Sherlock shoving him further back to the point where if James moved even an inch, James would fall down into the streets below. James let out a whoop, his gaze never leaving Sherlock's eyes as he held his arms out wide, trusting the detective to not let him fall. Okay, let me give you a little extra incentive. Your friends will die if you don't. Despite how hard Sherlock fought to keep it hidden, fear made its way into his blue-green eyes. John, Sherlock said quietly. Not just John, James' voice dropped to a whisper. Everyone. Mrs. Hudson, Sherlock said, rattling off those dearest to his heart, praying that Amelia wasn't on that list of who James was going to kill. Everyone, James repeated, grinning. Lestrade. 3 bullets, 3 gunmen, 3 victims, James said. There's no stopping them now. And Amelia? Sherlock asked hoarsely. James let out a barking laugh. Oh, I'll have my fun with her. I'll make her wish she were dead. Sherlock slowly pulled James back to the roof, back to safety. Unless my people see you jump, James said, carefully saying each word. Jim shook himself free of Sherlock's grasp with a triumphant smile, noticing Sherlock's horrified gaze. You can have me arrested, you can torture me, you can do anything you like with me, but nothing's going to prevent them from pulling the trigger. Your only 4 friends in the world will die, unless I kill myself. Complete your story, Sherlock finished hollowly. Oh, Amelia, I'm so sorry, Sherlock thought to himself. James nodded eagerly, smiling. You gotta admit, that's sexier. And I die in disgrace, Sherlock said with a scowl. Of course, James said. That's the point of this. Make Amelia not want you anymore. You're her hero, you know, and you're letting her down. He looked over the side, seeing the people milling about down below. Oh, you've got an audience now. Off you pop. James rolled his head from side to side as Sherlock stepped up onto the ledge. Go on, I told you how this ends. Your death is the one thing that's going to call off the killers. I'm certainly not going to do it. Sherlock turned to look at his nemesis, tears watering in his eyes. Sherlock blinked them anxiously, memories of Amelia running through his mind. Would you give me 1 moment, please? 1 moment of privacy? He glanced down at James from his spot on the ledge. Please? Of course, said, sounding disappointed as he moved away from Sherlock. Sherlock took in a short breath, unable to get enough air into his lungs. This was it. This was the end. There was no way he could get out of this unharmed. Someone would get hurt, and unfortunately, it was most likely going to be Amelia. Then an idea started to form in her head. Sherlock's eyes lit up thoughtfully, a smile growing across his face. He let out a loud guffaw, James spinning around fiercely to face Sherlock. What? James demanded angrily, as Sherlock continued to laugh. What is it? James glared at the detective hatefully, as he hopped off the ledge and started walking towards James. What did I miss? You're not going to do it, Sherlock quoted in McVeigh glee. So the killers can be called off. Then there's a recall code or a word or a number. He circled James. The predator-prey roles now reversed. Sherlock was reveled in his control, glad to know that he had the upper hand. I don't have to die, if I've got you. Oh, James laughed in delight, sounding relieved. You think you can make me stop the order? You think you can make me do that? Yes, Sherlock said, still circling him. So, do you? Sherlock, James tutted condescendingly. Your big brother, your dearest fiancé, and all the king's horses couldn't make me do a thing I didn't want to do. Sherlock stopped his circling, looking down at the criminal, seeing the terror in his dark eyes. Yes, but I'm not my brother, nor am I Amelia, remember? I am you, prepared to do anything, prepared to burn, prepared to do what ordinary people won't do. You want me to shake hands with you in hell? I shall not disappoint you. James shook his head slowly. Nah, he said, gazing up at the detective calmly, his thoughts flickering back to Amelia. You talk big. Nah, you're ordinary. You're ordinary. You're on the side of the angels. Oh, I may be on the side of the angels, Sherlock hissed ominously, but don't think for 1 second that I am one of them. The two of them locked eyes for a long moment, both of them battling for dominance over the other. Both of them fought for the 2 things that meant most to them. Sherlock fought for Amelia's safety, while James fought for vengeance. James had only started to realize how much Amelia actually meant to the detective. the brilliant detective and his angel who fell for him, and how far she had fallen. No, you're not, James blinked and closed his eyes, Sherlock mirroring his actions. James smiled and opened his eyes once more. I see, James cackled softly. You're not ordinary, no. You're me. You're me! Thank you! He let out a laugh happily, his voice slowly growing higher. He held his hand to shake Sherlock's hand. Sherlock Holmes, thank you. Bless you. As long as I'm alive, you can save your friends. You've got a way out. Well, good luck with that. James let out a mechanical grin, widening as his eyes as far as they could go as he pulled his mouth wide. He reached into his waistband and pulled out his gun, raising it towards his mouth and pulling the trigger. His body collapsed on the rooftop with soft but audible thud, his eyes staring blankly at nothing. Sherlock, who had flinched away as James pulled the trigger, eyed the corpse in horror, watching as blood trickled out the back of his head and headed for the lowest part in the roof, the dark crimson liquid staining the concrete. Sherlock spun away from the body, unable to look at it, grabbing his hair in his hands, terrified. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, please, Amy, forgive me, Sherlock thought, holding his hand over his mouth in panic. He looked back at James, fixed grinned as if the consulting criminal was having his last laugh. Sherlock, heavy breathing, began to slow as Sherlock stepped up onto the ledge, ready to commit one final act of selflessness. Sherlock took out his phone from his pocket slowly as he saw John's taxi pull up. Sherlock pressed the speed dial for John's number, just as the two Watsons stepped out of the cab. Upon seeing Amelia, Sherlock's heart broke. Her hair flew wildly all over the place. Her silver eyes darted around, panicked and alert. Hello? John answered his phone, heading back towards the hospital with Amelia. John, Sherlock said simply, his voice cracking in pain as he watched Amelia. Hey, Sherlock, you okay? John asked. Turn around and walk back the way you came now, Sherlock ordered tearfully, pleading with his friend to listen to the detective for once. No, I'm coming in, protested John. Just do as I asked, Sherlock said urgently. Please. John looked to Amelia and gave her Sherlock's instructions, both of them returning back to their original spot. Where? John pressed, Amelia frantically searching around for her fiancé. Stop there and put me on speakerphone, Sherlock demanded, knowing that, as much as it would pain Amelia, she would want to hear his next words. Sherlock? John drawled worriedly. Okay, look up. I'm on the rooftop, Sherlock said. Amelia let out a choked sob, and from his place on the ledge, Sherlock could see her hands flying to her mouth. Oh, God, she cried. I can't come down, Sherlock said sadly, stumbling over his words, as he saw the pained look of both of the Watson faces. So we'll just have to do it like this. What's going on? John asked anxiously. An apology. It's all true, Sherlock answered, lying to the two people who were closest to his heart. What? Amelia sputtered, turning ashen. Her eyes widened in shock, refusing to believe Sherlock's words. Everything they said about me? I invented Moriarty. Sherlock looked back over his shoulder at James, smiling from. Both of the Watsons staring up at Sherlock in disbelief. Why are you saying this? John reached to wrap an arm around Amelia's shoulder, an arm which Amelia immediately pushed away, silent tears streaming down her cheeks, leaving salty tracks. Sherlock's voice broke in pain. I'm a fake. Sherlock, Amelia whispered in horror, just loud enough for Sherlock to hear. Her left hand felt empty without the ring that typically nestled around her finger, which made her look down with a sad expression, regretting her actions. The newspapers were right all along, continued on Sherlock. I want you to tell Lestrade. I want you to tell Mrs. Hudson and Molly. In fact, tell anyone who listened to you that I created Moriarty for my own purposes. Okay, shut up, Sherlock, shut up, John snapped. The first time we met, you knew all about Harriet, right? Nobody could be that clever, Sherlock said sadly. You could, Amelia said softly. Sherlock let out a hollow laugh, surprised to find a tear dripping from his chin. I researched you, Sherlock said to John. Before we met, I discovered everything that I could to impress you. It's a trick. Just a magic trick. That's why I didn't know anything about you, Amy. I couldn't find anything on you. No, Amelia said firmly, shaking her head as she started towards the hospital entrance. All right, stop it now. No, stay exactly where you are. Don't move, Sherlock said, holding his hand out towards Amelia. All right, she said, backing up with her hands raised in surrender, although she wanted nothing more to run to Sherlock and embrace him in a hug, and to never let go. Keep your eyes fixed on me, Sherlock said pleadingly, and take me off speaker, please. Will you do this for me? Do what? John said, complying with Sherlock's demand, holding his phone to his ear. This phone call, that's my note. It's what people do when it's what people do, don't they? Leave a note, Sherlock asked. When they have someone they love. Leave a note? When? Goodbye, John, Sherlock said sadly. No, don't, John said desperately, handing the phone to Amelia in a last-ditch effort to convince his friend to come down from the roof. Sherlock, Amelia said hoarsely, Sherlock hesitating before replying. Amy, I'm so sorry. I never meant for you to get involved. Sherlock nearly sobbed, tears rolling down his face. Sherlock, get down, please, Amelia begged. I can't. Why not? Amelia cried. I love you, Sherlock admitted for the first time, surprised at how easily the words flowed from his mouth. Despite getting engaged to the brilliant woman waiting for him below, he had never said that he loved her aloud, something he was deeply starting to regret. I love you too. Now come down, please, Amelia screamed at him, a few other people around her, shooting her a look. She reached up with one hand, taking her dark hair by the roots in an attempt to try and quell her rage. Shush, shush, shush. We'll see each other soon, I promise, Sherlock hushed shakily. Amy, I need you to do one last thing for me. Anything, Sherlock, anything. Amelia sobbed, wiping her tears away. Then Sherlock uttered his last words. Amy? Vatition Camos. He looked down at Amelia, his friend, his colleague, his bride-to-be. His lover, with a sad expression, eyes flickering to John. No! Sherlock! John screamed as John threw the phone aside and opened up his arms to the sky as if he were to embrace his fate. Then he fell. God, that scene always makes me cry. I can't... Oh, I hate that in this... Sherlock shouldn't have done that, but it makes a great plot twist in the show. And... Oh, the feels! Okay. Sorry, little rant over. 45. Burning. He tumbled through the air, his coat flying out behind him. The dark angel had fallen from grace, and there was no going back now. The wind whistled past Sherlock's ears, and everything moved in slow motion. He fell from the rooftop, his arms spread out wide. Sure, John mumbled in shocked eyes as his tumbling friend transfixed. Sherlock's body hit the ground with a muffled thud, the snap of his neck ringing in Amelia's ears on a constant loop. Amelia ran toward her fiancé's body in panic, falling to the ground as the cyclist biked into her. Her head hit the asphalt, gravel dinging into her exposed flesh and breaking the skin. She ignored the pain entirely, the adrenaline coursing through her veins, blocking it out. She struggled to get up, blinking as she tried to stay conscious, pushing her brother away as she ran to her side to help her up. She pushed her way through the growing crowd of people. Sherlock, Sherlock, Amelia muttered tearfully as she and John reached Sherlock's form, blood staining Sherlock's face, the crimson liquid standing out from Sherlock's pale skin. I'm a doctor. Let me come through, please, John begged, forcing people out of his way. No, Amelia cried, sobs racking her body. He's my fiancé, please. Amelia covered her mouth with her hand, muffled in her pain, almost animalistic shrieks that tried to burst out from her mouth. She watched, horrified, as John knelt to the ground and grabbed Sherlock's wrist, desperately searching for a pulse. A woman peeled his fingers off Sherlock's lifeless arm, pulling both of the Watsons away. Amelia struggled to break free, trying to get back to Sherlock's body in a desperate attempt to see if he was alive. One more miracle from him, that's all she needed. One more miracle. Please, let me just... Amelia begged frantically, her vision starting to spin. She struggled to stay upright, on the verge of fainting, people surrounding her, helping her up. All sounds had become muffled, and all Amelia could hear was her heartbeat in her ears. A heartbeat Sherlock, the man she loved, no longer had. Amelia watched silently as a small group of 4 people lifted Sherlock's body up onto a stretcher, wheeling him away. Another sob hitched in Amelia's throat as she watched Sherlock's corpse being taken away, her eyes never leaving his. She shook off the people supporting her, vaguely aware of a shock blanket being set around her shoulders haphazardly. She clutched it closer, wincing at the medical smell that it seemed to exude from it. An ambulance pulled up beside Amelia, its medics forcing her to take a seat, and while they checked her vital signs. She remained silent, though all the tests, and stared blankly at the wall of the vehicle. Sherlock, oh Sherlock, what have you done? Amelia thought. the words on an endless loop inside her mind. Mycroft's office. I hate you! Amelia shouted as she stormed into Mycroft's office, her eyes red and bloodshot. Mascara stained her face, and her fingernails had been bitten down to their beds. The door to Mycroft's office slammed against the wall, no doubt leaving a dent in the plaster. This is all your fault. Mycroft looked up. His usually cold glaze softened when he saw Amelia's state. Amy? No, don't you Amy me, Amelia snapped. Sherlock died because you told Moriarty everything. Could you not have kept your mouth shut? Was it really so difficult? There were a dozen different things you could have kept him for, but you just had to get more information out of him. Why do you always have to be the winner at everything? Amelia, Mycroft sighed, holding his head in his hands. I never dreamt that Moriarty would... Stop. Bullshit, Amelia screamed vehemently, her hands clenched at her side. You know what Moriarty was capable of. Why would you just let him go? Her voice cracked and dropped to a whisper. Why would you just let him go? She sat down on the ground of Mycroft's office, her knees pulled into her chest, silent tears streaming down her face. 3 hours, that's how long she'd been without Sherlock, and it was already killing her. Perhaps if she died, she would see him again. I'm sorry, Mycroft said softly. As you should be, Amelia spat, turning sharply on her heels and leaving Mycroft's office. As a pain reminder of all Mycroft had done, he never fixed the dent in the plaster, shooting a look at it every day to remind himself that Mycroft made mistakes, and that, occasionally, Mycroft lost. The dent was a flaw in an otherwise neat and orderly room, just as this mistake was Mycroft's flaw, a flaw Mycroft would never forget. By the end of the week, Amelia and Sherlock's faces were plastered all over every newspaper in the entire country, in most of the world, all depicting their tragic love story. Amelia, out of spite, had picked a copy up and scanned it, only to throw it into the fire. John had refused to return back to 221B, and the flat was unnervingly silent without either of Amelia's flatmates. Mrs. Hudson checked up on Amelia every few hours, making sure Amelia ate and slept rather than wasting away that Amelia had planned to. Amelia got up from her chair with a heavy sigh, walking over to Sherlock's violin and picking it up gingerly. She cradled it in her hands like a newborn child, like the newborn child she and Sherlock would never have. Amelia stiffened at the thought, shaking it from her mind. She picked up Sherlock's bow from its place on the desk hesitantly before sliding it across the strings gently, the notes humming in the air. Slowly, Amelia began to play a song. Her song. The song Sherlock had composed specifically for her. She closed her eyes, immersing herself in the music. Her emotions rose and fell with the crescendos and the decrescendos, each bar composing of impossible-to-play seeming notes that sprawled with each other, each complementing another. "Ooh, that was lovely, dear," Mrs. Hudson said kindly, breaking Amelia's concentration. Amelia opened her eyes and blinked several times. "Sherlock wrote it for me," she said simply. "Always a romantic, that one, wasn't he?" "No," Amelia said softly, much to Miss Hudson's surprise. "I don't think he was." She set the violin down. I mean, he had his moments, but he wasn't a romantic. Mrs. Hudson gave her an odd look and went to the kitchen, preparing a meal for Amelia. "Would you like a cuppa, dear?" "No." Despite Amelia's answer, Miss Hudson set the kettle on. Amelia pondered over Sherlock's words. Vatican Camus. Vatican Camus meant battle stations, that something was going to die or get hurt. Was there a meaning behind his last words, or was he just trying to say he was going to fall? Amelia thought it was the former. Sherlock tended to have a deeper meaning behind his words, and if he hadn't meant to, just before he had fallen, Sherlock had said he loved her, and Amelia had given the same reply. The star-crossed lovers who fell from heaven to be with each other, Amelia thought and amused. A modern-day Romeo and Juliet. How pathetic. Amelia looked at Sherlock's chair, envisioned him sitting there, as he had so many times before, commenting on Amelia's behavior. "You're being melodramatic," she imagined him saying. "I'm only dead." "Only," Amelia would reply back. "You always underestimated yourself, sure." Every single time. Why can't you let someone love you without having to twist it? Because if I let them love me, they're going to get hurt in the process, his disembodied voice said. And what if I want to get hurt? What would you do then? Marry you. You can't. You're dead, Amelia would reply. And the entire conversation would start all over again. Amelia pushed herself out of her chair, padding to the bathroom. She reached under the sink, grabbed a bottle of bourbon that Amelia hid there for occasions such as these. She took a large swig, the liquid burning its way down her throat. And so she drank until she passed out. Amelia was dressed entirely in white, and her hair was elegantly piled atop her head. A corset was laced around her waist, and over top of it, she wore... Jeez. She wore a vintage white gown, which had a white lace back and long lace train that trailed out behind her. More lace covered sleeves up until her elbow, and covered the rest of the dress in a thin layer as well. Amelia found the sheer amount of lace a tad excessive. She clutched a bouquet of forget-me-nots, lilacs, all framing a large lotus flower, the occasional ivy branch intertwined in. Nervous, asked Mycroft, who stood beside her, looking dapper in a finer, fitted ash gray suit. A bit, Amelia admitted sheepishly. Your hand is shaking, Mycroft pointed out, looking down Amelia's hand. It's only a wedding. Only a wedding? Amelia repeated hollowly. Yeah, my wedding. Don't be nervous, Mycroft said. It'll be over soon. I hope so, Amelia murmured, lifting a hand up to run a hand through her hair, but stopped shortly, remembering that if she did, she'd ruin the delicate braid tied in a knot. As the wedding march began to play, Amelia held her banquet even tighter, to the point where she was nearly crushing the flowers. Smile, ordered Mycroft. It suits you. Amelia shot him a dark look as the doors opened. As soon as she laid eyes on Sherlock, who stood, looking very handsome, in a jet-black suit at the altar, all of Amelia's cares were forgotten. John waited patiently by his best friend's side, his hands clasped before him. John had a single lotus flower pinned to his lapel, signifying him as the best man, and the Watsons' mother stood outside of John, dressed in a royal purple cocktail dress, another lotus flower tucked behind her ear. But it was Sherlock that Amelia's gaze was immediately drawn to. His hair had been combed, for once, and slicked back. His entire body was stiff, and a small smile tugged at the corner of his thin lips. Sherlock's eyes sparkled with sheer and utter joy. Amelia's weak smile grew until it stretched completely across her face, Sherlock immediately returning the action. It seemed like an eternity until Amelia and Mycroft reached the altar. Thank you, Amelia murmured to Mycroft, who nodded in response. Might I say, my dear, you look ravishing, Sherlock complimented quietly. Thank you, Amelia blushed madly. You don't look too bad yourself. Dearly beloved, said the pastor, we are gathered here today, in the sight of God and in the face of this company, to join this man and woman in holy matrimony. If there is anyone who objects to this union, please speak now or forever hold your peace. The pastor paused, then cackled mechanically, his voice changing from a London accent to one with an Irish lilt. Why am I asking? I object to this marriage. Amelia looked up at the pastor's face from under her veil, her eyes widening at the sight. The pastor's face had morphed into none other than James Moriarty. He grinned psychotically. You didn't really think I'd let you get away that easily, did you? Out of nowhere, James produced a knife, plunging it into Sherlock's chest, twisting it up to hit his heart. Sherlock looked out at the knife protruding from under his ribcage, the crimson-colored blood seeping into his suit and staining the fabric, leaving a dark red blob painted across Sherlock's chest. He fell to the ground, a high scream bursting from Amelia's mouth in her terror. Mycroft? John! Someone! Amelia started pleadingly, searching around frantically for someone to help her, only to find they had all disappeared. Moriarty cackled as Amelia turned around to find that Moriarty became a large spider with Moriarty's head. He scuttled towards her, the movement of Moriarty's 8 long legs causing Amelia to feel sick. Don't be preposterous, Moriarty scolded as Amelia started towards the door. There's no escaping me, Amelia, dear. I've thought of every way out. He glanced back at Sherlock. I promised to burn his heart out. But it seems I haven't burned you. Not quite yet, anyways. Let's change that, shall we? A circle of fire lit around Amelia, closing in on her. She couldn't do anything but scream as the fire licked at her dress, and all too soon, her dress was consumed by the flames. The flames crept up to her, lapping at her exposed flesh. Amelia burned and burned and burned. Once the fire had consumed her, the wet had started again. No matter what she did to avoid it, it always ended the same. Moriarty killing Sherlock wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the fire that always caught up to her in the end. Because as long as there are embers, there will always be a flame.